There is a moment, right before everything falls apart, when a person discovers who they really are. It happened to a man named Marco on a Tuesday morning that started like every other morning. He drank his coffee. He checked his phone. And then, in a single phone call that lasted less than 90 seconds, he learned that the company he had built for 11 years was gone. Frozen accounts, a partner who had vanished with the money, a lawsuit already filed. Most people in that moment would have felt the floor disappear beneath them. Marco felt something else. He felt strangely, unsettlingly calm. And when you understand why, you will understand something that could change the way you move through every hard moment left in your life. Because the secret Marco stumbled into that morning was not luck, and it was not a personality trait he was simply born with. It was a set of ideas, tested for over 2,000 years, by men who buried their children, who were exiled from their homes, who were enslaved, who ruled empires, who faced death not as an abstraction but as a knock on the door. Today, we are going to walk through the Stoic, secrets that build something rare in this world. A human being who is truly, deeply, unshakably fearless. Not reckless, not numb, fearless in the way a mountain is fearless of the storm, because it has already made peace with the wind. Welcome to Wisdom of the Stoics, the home for anyone who wants ancient wisdom for the modern mind. On this channel, we take the writings of men like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus and Seneca, philosophers who lived thousands of years ago, and we translate their ideas into something you can actually use this week. In your job, in your relationships, in the quiet moments when your mind won't stop racing at 2 in the morning. We are not here to make Stoicism sound like a dusty museum exhibit. We are here to make it a tool you carry with you, the way you'd carry a knife into the woods. Sharp, useful, and there when you need it most. If that sounds like something you need in your life right now, stay with me for the next half hour, because what you are about to hear may be the most important video you watch this year. And if you find value in what we do here, consider becoming part of this community by subscribing, because we release videos exactly like this one designed to arm you with wisdom. The modern world forgot how to teach. Let's go back to Marco for a moment, because his story is the thread we're going to follow through everything else. Marco was not a philosopher. He didn't read Latin. He ran a small logistics company, the unglamorous kind of business that moves boxes from one place to another, and he had built it from nothing, starting in a rented garage with 2 borrowed trucks. For years, his life was defined by forward motion. More contracts, more trucks, more employees who depended on him for their mortgage payments and their children's school fees. And like so many of us, Marco had quietly, without ever deciding to, made his business the center of his identity. Ask him who he was, and he would answer with what he did. Take away the company, and in his own mind, you would take away Marco. So when the call came that Tuesday morning, telling him that his business partner had drained the accounts and disappeared, and that clients were already lining up lawyers, Marco should have collapsed. By every normal measure, this was the kind of event that ends a person, at least for a while. It's the kind of loss that keeps you in bed for a week, that turns your stomach to acid, that makes you snap at the people you love the most. And for the first 10 minutes, that's exactly what happened to Marco. His hands shook. His chest tightened. He felt the particular kind of dread that comes when your whole future seems to be dissolving in real time. But then something strange happened. Marco remembered a conversation he'd had 2 years earlier with an old professor of his, a man named James, who had once made an offhand comment about a Roman emperor who wrote himself notes at night, notes nobody was ever supposed to read, about how to keep his mind steady while ruling an empire during plague, war, and betrayal. That emperor was Marcus Aurelius, and the notes eventually became one of the most quietly powerful books ever written, Meditations. Marco had bought a cheap copy on a whim, read maybe 20 pages, and left it on a shelf gathering dust. But in that moment of crisis, one particular line surfaced in his memory, almost like his mind had been holding on to it for exactly this day. Marcus Aurelius had written that the things which trouble us are not the events. themselves, but our judgments about those events, and that it is within our power to wipe out that judgment now. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but sit with it for a second, because this single idea is the foundation for everything we're going to build today. The event was real. The money was gone. The lawsuit was real, but the terror, the sense that his life was ending, the spiral of catastrophic thoughts about homelessness and failure and shame, those were not facts. Those were interpretations generated by Marco's own mind, layered on top of the raw event like paint over a canvas. And if the paint was something his mind had put there, then his mind could, with effort and practice, take it off again. This is the first Stoic secret to fearlessness, and it might be the most important one. You are not afraid of what is actually happening to you. You are afraid of the story you are telling yourself about what is happening to you. Separate the story from the fact, and you take away fear's fuel. I want you to think of a moment in your own life when you felt genuine dread, maybe about a health scare, a relationship ending, a job on the line. Now ask yourself honestly, in that moment, were you afraid of the literal event, the numbers on a page, the words in a text message, or were you afraid of the imagined future your mind built on top of it? The job loss itself is just an absence of income for some period of time. The fear is the story about becoming worthless, about your family losing respect for you, about ending up broke and alone. Notice how much heavier the story is than the fact. The Stoics weren't in denial about hardship. They weren't telling themselves comforting lies. They were making a precise, almost surgical distinction between what is happening and what you are adding to it. And that distinction is where your power lives. Epictetus, one of the three towering figures in Stoic philosophy, understood this better than almost anyone in human history, because he had more reason than most to feel powerless. He was born into slavery in what is now Turkey, sometime in the 1st century. His body was, by historical account, permanently injured, possibly from mistreatment by his master. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing about his external circumstances, not his labor, not his location, not even, in the eyes of Roman law, his own body. And yet Epictetus became one of the most influential teachers in the ancient world, a man whose lectures were later transcribed by a student and turned into a text, called the Enchiridion, or the handbook which soldiers, statesmen, and later a Roman emperor would carry with them for guidance. Epictetus built his entire philosophy on one dividing line, and once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. He said that some things are within our power and some things are not. Within our power are our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, in short, everything that is our own doing. Not within our power are our bodies, our property, our reputation, our position, in short, everything that is not our own doing. This is often called the dichotomy of control, and it is, in essence, a filter you can run every fear through. Ask yourself, is this thing I'm afraid of actually within my control? If it is, then fear is useless, because you should simply act. If it isn't, then fear is also useless, because no amount of anxiety will change an outcome that was never yours to determine in the first place. Either way, the fear itself turns out to be a wasted expenditure of energy spent on a problem it cannot solve. This doesn't mean you stop caring about outcomes. It means you stop attaching your peace of mind to things you were never in charge of. Let's bring this back to Marco, sitting in his office that Tuesday morning, phone still warm in his hand. He could not control the fact that his partner had stolen the money. He could not control what the clients would decide to do, whether they'd sue, whether they'd forgive him, whether the business could survive. Those things belonged to other people, to lawyers, to courts, to the unpredictable churn of circumstance. What he could control was much narrower and much more powerful than it first appeared. He could control what he did in the next hour. He could control whether he called a lawyer immediately or spent the day paralyzed. He could control the tone he used with his employees when he broke the news to them. He could control whether he treated this as the end of his story or as one difficult chapter within a much longer one. The moment Marco stopped fighting to control the uncontrollable and started pouring all of his energy into the narrow, real, actionable space that was actually his, something shifted. The dread didn't vanish completely, because he wasn't a stone, he was a human being. But it stopped running the show. He made 3 phone calls that day. One to a lawyer, one to his top employee to coordinate a plan, and one to his wife, to tell her the truth without dressing it up or hiding behind false optimism. Each call got a little easier, not because the situation improved, but because Marco kept discovering again and again that he was capable of acting clearly even while afraid. And that discovery, that you can be afraid and still function, still think, still choose, is the real seed of fearlessness. Fearlessness was never about the absence of fear. It's about the refusal to let fear make your decisions for you. I want to introduce you to someone else now, a woman named Elena, because fear doesn't only show up in dramatic, cinematic moments like the collapse of a company. Sometimes it shows up quietly, disguised as ordinary anxiety, and it can be just as corrosive over a longer stretch of time. Elena was a nurse in a busy hospital, and by any outside measure her life was stable. Steady job, a small apartment, a close circle of friends. But Elena lived with a particular kind of fear that many people will recognize instantly, the fear of what other people thought of her. She rehearsed conversations before they happened. She replayed conversations after they happened, scanning for any sign she had said the wrong thing, offended someone, revealed too much of herself. She turned down a promotion because it would mean leading a team, and leading a team meant being watched, judged, evaluated constantly, and Elena could not bear the thought of being watched that closely. If you've ever felt this way, you know it doesn't look like fear from the outside. It looks like modesty or carefulness or simply being a private person. But underneath it, quietly running the whole operation, is fear, specifically fear of other people's opinions, fear of reputation, fear of how you appear in the minds of others. A category of thing that Epictetus placed firmly outside of your control. And this is where Stoicism becomes almost uncomfortably direct with you, because it asks a question most of us avoid asking ourselves. Why are you giving so much power over your peace of mind to a thing you cannot control in the first place? Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal, that same emperor whose words reached Marco through an old professor, wrestled with this exact issue because even an emperor, a man with more external power than almost anyone alive at the time, was not immune to caring what others thought of him. He wrote to himself, essentially reminding himself that when he wanted to feel comforted, he should think of the qualities of the people around him, most of whom he admitted he could not fully trust to judge him fairly, because they too were driven by their own confusions, ambitions and blind spots. In other words, the Emperor of Rome was quietly telling himself, stop outsourcing your self-worth to an audience that doesn't even know what it's talking about. This is a hard truth to swallow, because we are social animals, wired over hundreds of thousands of years to care deeply about our standing within the group, since in our evolutionary past, being cast out of the group could mean death. But the modern world has hijacked that ancient wiring. It's no longer your tribe of 30 people whose opinion determines your survival. It's an audience of anonymous strangers, co-workers who barely think about you when you're not in the room, acquaintances whose judgments shift with the wind. And yet we let that audience dictate our choices, our careers, our silence, our fear. Elena's turning point came, oddly enough, not from a book, but from a conversation with Marco, who by this time had become a close friend of hers, both of them part of a small group that met occasionally to talk through hard things. Marco told her about the phone calls he'd made the day his business fell apart, about how the fear of what his employees would think of him almost stopped him from calling them at all, and how he realized, in that moment of hesitation, that he was about to let his fear of their judgment cost him the chance to actually help them. He told her something simple, something almost embarrassingly plain, but it landed for her like a small earthquake. The people whose respect you're afraid of losing are, statistically, thinking about you far less than you imagine. And even when they are thinking about you, their opinion has zero effect on the actual quality of your character. Seneca, the third of our great Stoic teachers, a man who served as an advisor to the Emperor Nero, a role that eventually got him ordered to take his own life, wrote extensively about this exact trap in his letters to a friend named Lucilius. Seneca had, in many ways, more reason than almost anyone to be consumed by fear of what others thought, because in the court of Nero, reputation could be the difference between life and death, quite literally. And yet Seneca kept returning, letter after letter, to the same insistence that a person's worth cannot be borrowed from the crowd, and cannot be destroyed by the crowd either, because the crowd is fickle, uninformed, and frequently wrong. He told Lucilius that it is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who craves more, and this applies just as much to the craving for approval as it does to the craving for money. Elena didn't transform overnight. Nobody does. But she started with something small. She took the promotion, not because her fear disappeared, but because she decided deliberately that the discomfort of being watched was a smaller price to pay than the slow erosion of a life spent shrinking to avoid judgment. In her first team meeting as a lead, her voice shook a little. She noticed it and she kept talking anyway. That, right there, in that shaking voice that refused to stop, is what fearlessness actually looks like in practice. It is almost never the absence of nerves. It is the decision to act despite them, because you've recognized that the nerves were never a reliable signal of real danger in the first place. Only an old evolutionary alarm system firing at the wrong target. Now I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Think about one area of your life right now where fear of judgment is quietly steering your choices. Maybe it's a business idea you haven't started because you're afraid of looking foolish if it fails. Maybe it's a relationship where you stay silent about what you actually need because you're afraid of seeming difficult. Maybe it's a creative project, sitting in a drawer because you're afraid of what your family would say. I'd genuinely love for you to put that in the comments below, because naming the fear, actually writing it down in plain words, is itself a Stoic exercise, one that strips the fear of some of its power the moment it leaves the vague fog of your mind and becomes a specific sentence on a screen. Let's talk now about a technique the Stoics practice deliberately, almost like training for the mind, because fearlessness in Stoicism was never treated as a personality trait you either have or don't have. It was treated as a skill, built through repetition, the same way a soldier trains before battle, or an athlete trains before competition. This technique is called premeditatio malorum, which translates roughly to the premeditation of evils, and at first glance, it sounds like the opposite of what you'd expect from a philosophy about becoming fearless. It sounds like deliberately imagining bad things happening to you. Seneca described this practice in one of his letters, advising that nothing should ever come as a total surprise to us, and that our minds should run ahead into the future and consider everything that could possibly happen, not to torment ourselves, but so that when hardship does arrive, we meet it having already rehearsed our response. He wrote about picturing exile, poverty, illness, even death itself, not as morbid obsession, but as a kind of psychological armor worn in advance, so that when misfortune actually knocks, it finds you prepared rather than shattered. Here's why this works, and why it isn't the same thing as anxious catastrophizing, which is something many of us already do, involuntarily, and which only makes us miserable, without making us prepared. The difference lies in intention and structure. Anxious catastrophizing is passive. It loops uncontrollably, it exaggerates, it offers no resolution, and it happens to you rather than being directed by you. Premeditatio malorum is active. You sit down deliberately for a defined period of time, and you walk through a specific, difficult scenario with clear eyes. What would I actually do if I lost my job tomorrow? What would my first 3 steps be? Who would I call? What would I say? What resources do I actually have that I'm forgetting about in my panic? And then, crucially, you close the exercise, you set it down. and you return to your day. Marco, without ever having read Seneca's letters directly, had done a rough version of this without realizing it, simply because his mind had been circling around business risk for years, quietly imagining what he'd do if a client left, if a truck broke down, if a shipment was lost. When the actual disaster came, in a form far worse than anything he'd specifically imagined, the general muscle of having thought through hard scenarios before still served him. His mind wasn't encountering the shape of catastrophe for the very first time. It had trained informally for exactly this kind of moment. I want you to try a small version of this yourself. Right now, as you're listening, think of the thing you fear most in your life at this moment. Not the vague, foggy version of the fear, but the specific, concrete version. If you're afraid of losing your job, don't just feel the dread, walk through it. Imagine the actual morning you'd get the news. Imagine what you would do that same day. Imagine who you'd call first. Imagine, honestly, whether you would survive it. Because the truth, almost every single time, is that you would. Painfully, uncomfortably, but you would survive it. And once your mind has walked that path even once in a calm, deliberate way, the fear loses a significant portion of its grip. Because fear feeds on vagueness and mystery, and it starves on specificity and familiarity. There is another practice closely related that Marcus Aurelius returned to again and again throughout meditations, and it might be the most psychologically bold idea in the entire Stoic tradition. It's often called memento mori, remember that you will die. This sounds, on the surface, like something dark, even morbid, the kind of thing you'd expect from a philosophy obsessed with hardship. But in practice, it is one of the most liberating ideas a human being can hold in their mind, because so much of our fear, if you trace it back far enough, is ultimately a fear of death, or a fear of the small losses that remind us of death. The loss of status, the loss of youth, the loss of certainty, the loss of control. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself that he could leave this life at any moment, and he should shape his every act and thought accordingly. He wasn't writing this to depress himself. He was writing it because he understood something that modern psychology has since confirmed in different language, that when people confront the reality of their mortality directly, rather than avoiding it, they often become clearer about what actually matters, and lighter about what doesn't. The small humiliations, the minor social anxieties, the fear of an uncomfortable email, all of it shrinks dramatically in significance when held up against the plain fact that your time here is finite and already, right now, running. There's a particular story about Marcus Aurelius that captures this beautifully. As emperor, he had a servant whose job, according to some ancient sources, was to walk behind him during triumphal processions and whisper into his ear, again and again, "Remember, you are mortal." Picture that. The most powerful man in the known world, cheered by crowds, draped in the trappings of near-divine status. And he had arranged deliberately for someone to keep whispering the one truth that would keep his ego and his fear both in check. He was not afraid of death because he denied it. He was, in a strange way, made calmer by facing it directly, because facing it stripped away everything false and left only what was real. I think of Elena again here, because after she took that promotion, after her voice stopped shaking quite so much in meetings, she went through a health scare of her own, a lump that turned out, thankfully, to be benign, but for about 2 weeks she did not know that. And she had to sit with the real possibility of a serious diagnosis. She told the group later that those 2 weeks, as frightening as they were, gave her a strange gift. Every small anxiety she used to carry, about what a coworker thought of her tone in an email, about whether she'd said something slightly wrong at dinner, simply evaporated. Not because she decided to let them go through willpower, but because, held up against the possibility of a life-threatening diagnosis, they revealed themselves as the tiny, insignificant things they had always been. When the results came back clear, she made a decision. She didn't want to wait for another scare to access that clarity. She wanted to hold on to the perspective that fear of death, faced honestly, had given her, without needing the actual threat to keep renewing it. This is exactly what Memento Mori is designed to do. It's a deliberate, repeated reminder not to make you fear death more, but to use the fact of death as a filter that burns away trivial fears and leaves you focused on what genuinely matters, how you're spending your finite days, whether you're living according to your own values or according to a script written by other people's expectations, whether you're speaking honestly to the people you love or holding back out of hobbyist. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you to do something for this channel, because if these ideas are landing for you, the algorithm that decides who else gets to see this video is watching. How you engage with it right now. If you've made it this far, take 2 seconds and hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this video reach someone else who might need to hear exactly this, on a day exactly like the one you might be having right now. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics, because we're building something here, a place where ancient philosophy stops being abstract and starts becoming armor you actually wear into your daily life. Let's move now to a technique that Marcus Aurelius used specifically to deal with fear rooted in feeling small, overwhelmed, or trapped inside a problem that seemed too large to survive. It's sometimes called the view from above, and it's a mental exercise where you imagine yourself rising up, higher and higher, above your immediate circumstances, above your city, above the country, until you can picture the entire scope of human life unfolding across the earth. All its wars and celebrations and griefs and joys happening simultaneously, none of it permanent, all of it part of a vast continuous flow. Marcus Aurelius used this technique to put his role as emperor, an almost unimaginably heavy responsibility, into proper proportion. He reminded himself that entire empires had risen and fallen, that great men whose names had once dominated the news of their time were now forgotten by nearly everyone, that the scale of human history was so vast that even the largest personal crisis, viewed from a great enough height, becomes a single small wave in an enormous ocean. This isn't meant to make your problems feel meaningless in a nihilistic, uncaring way. It's meant to correct a distortion that fear creates. The distortion that makes your current crisis feel like it is the entire universe, when in fact it is one moment, in one life among billions of lives, across thousands of years of human experience, most of which involved people surviving things at least as hard as what you're facing now. Marco used a version of this, again without knowing its Stoic name, in the weeks after his business collapsed. He told Elena, during one of their group meetings, that he had started taking long walks at night, and during those walks he would deliberately think about how many people, throughout history, had lost everything and rebuilt, not in a way that minimized his own pain, but in a way that reminded him he was not the first human being to stand in the wreckage of a failed plan and have to decide what to do next. He was joining a long line of people who had faced exactly this kind of moment, and most of them eventually found their footing again. That thought didn't erase the fear, but it shrank it down to a manageable size, small enough to actually hold, rather than something so large it swallowed him whole. I want to bring in James now, the professor whose offhand comment about Marcus Aurelius had planted the seed in Marco's mind years earlier, because James's own story shows a slightly different face of fear, one that many people carry silently for decades without ever naming it directly. James had spent his entire career in academia, respected, tenured, comfortable. But underneath that comfort was a fear he rarely admitted even to himself, the fear of being ordinary. He had, in his 20s, dreamed of writing something significant, a book that would matter, ideas that would outlive him. Instead, decades passed in the safe, steady rhythm of lectures and grading and modest publications that few people outside his narrow field would ever read. He wasn't unhappy exactly, but there was a quiet, persistent ache, the fear that he had let his one chance at something larger slip through his fingers, because it was easier and safer to stay where he was. This is a different flavor of fear than the dramatic collapse Marco faced, or the social anxiety Elena carried. It is the slow, creeping fear of regret, The fear that shows up not in a single terrifying moment, but in the quiet accumulation of years spent avoiding risk. And Stoicism has something specific to say about this too, something rooted in the idea of virtue as the only true good. This idea sits at the very center of Stoic philosophy, and it might be the single most radical claim the Stoics ever made. They argued that external things, wealth, reputation, health, even life itself, are not truly good or truly bad in themselves. They are what the Stoics called indifferents, things that can be used well or used poorly, but that do not determine the actual quality of a person's character. The only true good in Stoic thought is virtue, meaning wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline, exercised through your own choices. Everything else, wealth or poverty, health or sickness, praise or blame, success or failure, is external and therefore, by the Stoic dichotomy of control, not truly yours to claim credit for or to be destroyed by. For James, this idea landed with unusual force because it reframed the entire question that had been quietly haunting him. He had been measuring his life against an external standard: fame, publication, recognition, things entirely outside his control, subject to luck, timing, and the unpredictable taste of readers and institutions. But the actual thing within his control, whether he lived with courage, whether he pursued his ideas honestly, whether he treated his students with genuine care, whether he told the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, that had been available to him the entire time, regardless of how many books he published or how famous he became. At 61 years old, James finally sat down and began writing the book he had wanted to write in his 20s. Not because he suddenly believed it would make him famous, that outcome was never his to control anyway, but because writing it honestly, with real courage, was itself the good, the virtue, the thing Stoicism said actually mattered. He told Marco and Elena in one of their conversations that he wished he had understood this 40 years earlier, because the fear of being ordinary had cost him decades of hesitation, when the truth was that ordinariness was never the real danger. The real danger had been living, according to a story about external validation instead of according to his own courage. This brings us to something crucial about Stoic fearlessness that I think gets misunderstood constantly in modern culture, where the word Stoic has been flattened into something cold, emotionless, a stiff upper lip, a person who simply suppresses feeling. That is not what these three men taught, and it's not what Marco, Elena, or James discovered either. Seneca wept when his friends died. Marcus Aurelius wrote openly about grief in his journal after the death of people close to him. Epictetus taught about compassion and care for others constantly throughout his lectures. Stoic fearlessness was never about becoming numb. It was about becoming discerning, learning to separate the things worth fearing, which turn out to be remarkably few, from the things we've simply been trained by habit, culture, and evolution to fear without examination. Let's talk about what actually is worth taking seriously in Stoic thought, because fearlessness doesn't mean recklessness, and it doesn't mean pretending that nothing matters. The Stoics drew a sharp line between fear, which is an anxious anticipation of a future evil, and caution, which is a reasoned, deliberate care about outcomes that remain within your influence. A Stoic doesn't walk carelessly into traffic to prove a philosophical point. A Stoic still locks their doors, still saves money, still goes to the doctor when something feels wrong. The dichotomy of control was never an excuse for passivity. It was a filter for where to spend your emotional energy, so that the energy left over, once fear had been drained of the things it was wasted on, could be redirected entirely into deliberate, careful action on the things that were actually yours to influence. Marco didn't sit back passively after his business collapsed, telling himself none of it mattered because it was all external. He fought hard through the legal process. He rebuilt slowly. He took a job driving one of his old trucks for a competitor for nearly a year while he saved enough to try again on a much smaller scale. The Stoic reframe didn't remove his motivation to act. It removed the paralysis that fear had been causing and redirected that same energy into clear, deliberate movement. This is the part people miss when they imagine Stoicism as passive resignation. It's the opposite. It's an intensely active philosophy, precisely because it refuses to waste energy on anxiety about things beyond your control, freeing every last bit of that energy for the things within it. There's a particular passage from Epictetus that I think about often, where he compares life to a sea voyage. When the ship stops at a port, he says, "And you go ashore to gather water. You might pick up a small shellfish or a vegetable along the way, but your mind should always be on the ship, ready to return the moment the captain calls. Because if you wander too far chasing after the small pleasures on shore, you risk being left behind, dragged aboard by force, tied up like cargo." This is one of the most vivid images in all of Stoic literature, and it captures something essential about fearlessness. It's not that the small things in life, wealth, comfort, relationships, achievements, don't matter at all. It's that you hold them the way you'd hold that shellfish, with a light grip, gathered along the way, enjoyed while you have them, but never so tightly clutched that losing them destroys you. Because the ship, the larger arc of your life and character, was always the real point of the journey. I think this is why fear grips us so tightly in the modern world, more tightly in some ways than it gripped people in harder, more physically dangerous eras of human history. We have, almost without noticing, tied our entire identity to things Epictetus would call the shellfish. Our job title, our social media following, our relationship status, our bank balance. We clutch these things so hard that the mere possibility of losing them triggers something close to existential terror, when in truth, these things were never meant to be held that tightly. They were meant to be enjoyed, used, appreciated, and released when circumstances demanded it. While the ship, your actual character, your courage, your integrity, your capacity to keep choosing well no matter what happens around you, sails on regardless. Elena told the group something, months after her health scare, that I think captures the entire arc of what we've been discussing. She said that fear, before she'd encountered these ideas, had felt like an ocean. She was constantly treading water in, exhausting, endless, with no shore in sight. Afterward, it felt more like weather. Real, sometimes uncomfortable, occasionally severe, but something that passed through rather than something she was drowning in permanently. Fear didn't disappear from her life. She still felt her pulse quicken before a difficult conversation. She still felt a jolt of anxiety when her phone rang unexpectedly late at night. But she had learned to hold that fear the way you'd hold a passing storm, with the understanding that storms end, and that her job was simply to keep steering the ship through it rather than abandoning the wheel entirely. I want to give you something practical now, a way to actually apply everything we've discussed today, because ideas without practice remain just ideas, pleasant to listen to, forgotten by tomorrow. Here is a simple structure, drawn directly from the 3 teachers we've spent this video with, that you can use the next time fear grips you, whether it's a small daily anxiety or something as large as what Marco faced that Tuesday morning. First, separate the fact from the story. Ask yourself plainly, what has actually happened in the fewest possible words, stripped of interpretation? Then ask, what story have I added on top of that fact? And is that story something I actually know to be true, or something my mind has constructed out of fear? This alone, done honestly, diffuses an enormous percentage of everyday anxiety, because most of what we fear turns out to live entirely in the story, not in the fact. Second, run the dichotomy of control. Ask, what part of this situation is actually within my power to influence? And what part belongs entirely to other people, chance or time? Pour your energy exclusively into the first category. Consciously, deliberately. Release your grip on the second, not because it doesn't matter, but because gripping it tighter changes nothing except your own suffering. Third, use premeditatio malorum, deliberately and briefly. Sit with the worst realistic version of the outcome you're afraid of, not to spiral but to plan. Ask yourself what you would actually do if it happened, who you would call, what your first 3 steps would be. Then set the exercise down and return to the present, because its purpose was preparation, not rumination. Fourth, remember memento mori, not as a morbid dwelling on death, but as a filter. Ask yourself whether this particular fear will matter to you on your deathbed, whether it's worth the emotional energy you're currently spending on it, given the shortness and preciousness of the time you actually have. And fifth, take the view from above. Zoom out. Remind yourself that you are one person, in one moment, within an almost unimaginably vast sweep of human history, most of which was survived by people who faced hardships at least as severe as yours, usually with far fewer resources and far less understanding than you currently have available to you. These 5 steps are not a magic formula that erases fear instantly. Nothing does, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something false. But practiced consistently the way Marco, Elena, and James each practiced their own version of them, these steps do something quietly extraordinary over time. They change your relationship with fear itself. Fear stops being the thing that decides what you do. It becomes simply information, a signal worth noticing, occasionally worth heeding, but never again the master of your choices. I think often about how the video started, with Marco sitting in his office that Tuesday morning, phone still warm in his hand, the floor of his life seeming to disappear beneath him. I think about the version of that story where Marco never remembered that offhand comment from his old professor, where he never picked up that dusty copy of Meditations, where the fear simply won, and he spent the following months paralyzed instead of acting. That version of the story was entirely possible. It's the version that plays out for so many people, not because they're weaker or less capable, but because nobody ever handed them the tools to separate the fact from the story, to draw the line between what's theirs to control and what isn't, to rehearse hardship in advance so it doesn't ambush them unprepared. That's the entire purpose of everything we do here on Wisdom of the Stoics. These ideas are not decoration. They are not trivia about dead philosophers to make you sound clever at a dinner party. They are tools tested across 2,000 years by an enslaved man who became one of history's great teachers, by an advisor who faced the volatile temper of a dangerous emperor and still found the composure to write letters that comfort people today, by an actual emperor who whispered reminders of his own mortality to himself in the middle of unimaginable power, precisely so that fear and ego would never be allowed to run his life for him. Marco eventually rebuilt his business, smaller than before but on steadier ground, and he told the group once that he doesn't think of the collapse as the worst thing that happened to him anymore. He thinks of it as the day he found out what he was actually made of, which turned out to be far sturdier than he'd ever had reason to test before. Eleanor leads a full team now, and while her voice still occasionally shakes before a hard conversation, she no longer treats that shake as a signal to stay silent. James finished his book. It didn't make him famous. He told the group, laughing quietly, that he thinks perhaps 11 people have read it cover to cover. But he said those words without a trace of the old ache, because he understood, finally, that the courage it took to write it honestly was the actual good, the thing that was always his to claim, regardless of how many people ever turned its pages. If any part of their stories felt familiar to you today, if you recognized your own fear of judgment in Elena, your own fear of collapse in Marco, your own quiet fear of an ordinary, unrisked life in James, I want you to know that the path they walked is available to you too. It doesn't require becoming a scholar of ancient philosophy. It requires a handful of ideas, practiced deliberately day after day, until they become less like borrowed wisdom and more like your own instinct. I'd love to hear which of these ideas hit you the hardest today. Was it the dichotomy of control, learning to release your grip on what was never yours to hold? Was it premeditatio malorum, the deliberate rehearsal of hardship so it never catches you unprepared? Was it memento mori, the strange, clarifying gift of remembering that your time is finite? Tell me in the comments, because this channel exists as a genuine conversation, and I read every single one of them. And if this video gave you something real today, something you plan to actually carry with you this week, do 3 things for me. Like the video, because it tells YouTube to put this exact message in front of someone else who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics, because we are building a library of exactly this kind of practical, ancient wisdom, week after week, designed to arm you against the fear that keeps so many people small. And share this with one person in your life who is standing right now in a version of Marco's office, phone still warm in their hand, wondering if the floor is about to disappear beneath them. Because the truth these three ancient teachers spent their entire lives trying to hand down to us is this: the floor was never as solid as you thought it was, for any of us at any point, and that was never the tragedy it seemed to be. The moment you stop needing solid ground beneath your feet, the moment you build your steadiness inside yourself instead, is the exact moment you become the kind of person nothing can truly shake again. That is what it means to be fearless. Not the absence of storms, but the discovery that you were always strong enough to sail through them. I'll see you in the next one.